about the importance of India and China in driving the global economy. In fact, the other distinguished speakers also mentioned this fact. What we have been seeing in the last decade in particular is that the center of gravity of the global economy is shifting away from the advanced countries. And if you look at what the Goldman Sachs had predicted about the rise of the BRIC in the early part of last decade, the rise of China and India have far exceeded the predictions that Goldman Sachs had made then. India and China, together with the other countries in the East Asian region, are becoming ever so relevant in the global economy. And this has been proved in the events in the aftermath of the most recent downturn that the global economy had experienced, where these two countries were able to withstand the problems that were brought in by the global financial crisis. And what we also found is that the other countries in the East Asian region rebounded much faster than expected. So the stability, whatever little was provided in the aftermath of the downturn, was provided by these countries. Now the key question that arises here is that how have China and India been able to utilize their growing economic influence to change the discourse in the critical international forums? And here I'm going to look at only at the economic forums and how these different forums, which are providing the wherewithal of the global economic governance, are being shaped up by these two countries, the two growing economic powers. Now, as we all know that the global institutions, particularly in the areas of trade and finance, have been dominated by the advanced countries. Professor Sauraja mentioned this in his extremely lucid presentation. And these advanced countries have used their economic clout to actually dominate these institutions. They have also been coordinating their efforts, and something which is very interesting for us to recognize, that they've used forums such as the OECD and later the G7 to really shape these institutions for meeting their long-term economic aspirations. Now, while these countries have been, the small coterie of these countries have been dominating these institutions, the inevitable happened, which is that these institutions have suffered the democratic deficit. They have been ignoring the roles that they had to play in as development institutions, and they had thus put aside the needs of the lesser developed countries. Now, the last decade has shown that some changes are in the offing, and here India and China are playing their parts in altering the dynamics of some of these international organizations. And I'm going to just give a brief account of how things are happening. But let me also mention here that most of these initiatives are still in the works, and much more need to be done. And therefore, we need to understand how we cooperate with each other to change the dynamics of these institutions. The first is in the realm of the reform of the international financial institutions. Now, again, as we know that India and China have moved in unison to see how the two countries and the developing country group as a whole have a larger share in the running of these institutions. And one of the ways in which this can happen is through the increase in quota and the voting shares of these countries. Now, through the efforts that these countries have put together the last few years, in 2008 there was a decision, which was arrived at in the IMF, where the voting shares would be changed, and this we are going to see the evidence of it next year. But of course, there are indications, recent indications are there that there have been disagreements between the US and the EU, and quite naturally so. They would not like to yield the power that they had in these institutions on the methodology to change the shareholding pattern. So here I think there is some work that the two countries need to do to get the things going. Now, I would say that the reform of the international financial institutions is really the first step towards addressing the issue of macroeconomic management. Now, in the past, the burden of adjustment following global economic crisis inevitably fell on the developing countries. So this happened in the 80s, after the Great Debt Crisis. It had happened in the 90s. And many developing countries after the debt crisis in the 80s were put under the structural adjustment programs, and which have had severe impact on the development trajectories. The logical next step, in my view, is the management of the global capital markets, where I think these two countries, India, China, need to play a part, which, as the past experience has shown us since the Lehman collapse, need structural reforms. Ever since the debt crisis in the 1980s, there have been talk of improving the regulatory supervision of the banking sector. But the experience that we have had with the implementation of the Basel norms on capital adequacy and trying to bring better, more transparency in the functioning of the banking sector has shown that more efforts need to be put in by the emerging economies in this area too. Because again, the Western financial centers are unwilling to make the necessary changes. Now, while I would say that some of these areas in the global financial inform the global financial institutions, these are still work under progress. India and China can, I think, take more heart from the fact that they, along with some of the other emerging countries, were able to influence to an extent the dynamics of the multilateral trade negotiations. Again, Professor Sonaraja mentioned this, and also Mr. Go mentioned this about how the WTO is now one of the focus areas of these institutions. And in the ongoing Doha round of negotiations, we have found that there's been an emergence of a new Quad, the first four countries. In the earlier GATT, there used to be the US, EU, Japan and Canada, who were influencing the outcomes of the multilateral trade negotiations. But now we have had, since China joined the WTO in 2002, the emergence of the new Quad, China, India, Brazil and South Africa, which are trying to ensure that the development dimensions which are inherent in the Doha development agenda are implemented, particularly in the area of agriculture and health. Again, past speakers have mentioned this. I think these are two areas where the way India and China have negotiated with the United States and the European Union, who have had the stranglehold over the agricultural sector, is quite significant, because they've given leadership to a whole host of countries in Africa in particular, which have suffered because of a very unequal very unequal agreement on agriculture that was negotiated in the Uruguay round, and fundamental changes were therefore being pushed for in the Doha round, and that of course led to one of the major problems in the Doha round, the impasse that we are seeing now. Also in the area of health, bringing in the important recognition that the intellectual property regime cannot be antithetical to the global health needs is something that India and China have been emphasizing in these negotiations. I would say that the challenge that these countries have is to ensure that the integrity of the multilateral trading system is maintained, so that it delivers on the commitment to provide a non-discriminatory trading regime that is supportive of the development aspirations of the lesser players in the global system. Now, we've also heard about the area of climate change, where the basic countries, China, India, Brazil, and South Africa, have tried to meet the challenge to get an equitable outcome that is supportive of the development needs. Now, finally, I would like to talk about, just for a minute that I have with me, on the increasing relevance of BRICS. And I quite agree with other speakers who mentioned that, this whole dynamics of the BRICS is being led by India and China. And one particular issue on which there's been a lot of traction between the two countries is on the BRICS Development Bank. Now, as you all know that the world of development cooperation is now in a big melting pot. And what we saw last year in Busan, in the high-level forum on aid effectiveness, we found that the discourse of development cooperation has moved away from aid effectiveness to development partnership and effectiveness of development partnership. Now, it's one thing to provide a framework, but it is also very important to provide the backup financial support that is needed to run this new philosophy. And India and China, as the new players on the development cooperation area, can ideally provide the traction in this regard. The BRICS Development Bank idea was conceived of in the New Delhi summit. We're still trying to work out how this is going to play itself out. But I would say that this particular idea and others that were agreed to in the New Delhi summit will show quite clearly that what was being questioned as formation, the BRICS, not too long back, is now becoming one of the most important forums where India, China, along with the other emerging countries, can make a real difference to the global economy. Now, finally, I would say that the basic structure that India and China need to work on is that they need to strengthen the multilateral system of economic governance, and which would be based on the principles of equity. Now, in the past, we have seen developing countries come up with this whole idea of a new international economic order based on equity and justice. That couldn't be realized because they were not real players. They're not significant economic players on the global stage. But I think now the time has come where these countries, having reached a level of strength, or they have found their strengths, they can really influence the global processes more substantially. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dhar. I think Dr. Dhar's exposition has clearly pointed out the opportunities for regional cooperation, and particularly at multinational fora. And there are a number of areas where the two countries can be working together for advancing mutual interests. So we have two very interesting perspectives here. One on the area of trade and business, where what kind of a common growth is possible. And the other in the area of, I would say, strategy, diplomacy, and international architecture, where again there are opportunities for the two countries to grow together. So on this, I think I would like to open the floor for discussion.